and I want to introduce everyone to Dr. Ward, and we're so delighted that you can join us in particular during this time. Dr. Ward received medical training at McGill University, the University of London, and Johns Hopkins University. He obtained his research training at Oxford as a Rhodes Scholar and Johns Hopkins University. He joined McGill University in 1991, where he's now a full professor in infectious diseases. During his time at McGill, Dr. Ward served in many different capacities, including leadership roles at the McGill Vaccine Center, the Canadian Association for Immunization Research, and the Research Institute at the MUHC, which is at McGill, and the National Reference Center for Parasitology. He's currently the chair of the Institutional Advisory Board for the CIHR Institute of Infection and Immunity. Dr. Ward has worked with many vaccine companies, startups to multinationals, and currently he's serving as the medical officer for Medicago, which is a world leader in plant-based vaccine manufacturing, currently engaged in finding solutions for COVID-19. We thank Dr. Ward. We also thank Manish, who is one of our trainees who introduced us to Dr. Ward, and thank him for organizing this symposium for us. The floor is yours, Dr. Ward.
Well, I'm not sure if introduced or strong-armed is a better way of describing the interaction. Manish is a good friend and said he wanted me to do this, so I do what Manish tells me to do. So I think it's really important to outline that I have many conflicts of interest. I'm currently a professor at McGill University, but I'm also the medical officer for this company that's making vaccines in plants, and I have had over the years extensive interactions with different companies at the level of scientific advisory committee, clinical advisory committees, doing contracts, doing collaborative work, shared grants. And it's actually been a very interesting time. And if I'm allowed to share my screen, I have probably about 30 slides that I can go through that will give you some idea of where I've come from and why I think it's important that we talk about these things. And so the talk is sort of facetiously titled "Dancing with Elephants," and it's really quite true that most academics believe that we're in a very asymmetric relationship with industry. And so Manish asked me to talk about academic industrial collaborations and how they work. My route into this world started with some very good advice from John Bartlett, who was the head of infectious diseases at Johns Hopkins when I was there. And he is a grant-driven scientist all his life, but he said, always have at least one industry or government contract going. When the funding cycle is good, you won't need the money, but in bad funding cycles, these contracts will keep your lab in business. And that's actually very true, and you'll see on the last slide. So these next two slides are really just giving you an idea of, from the time I arrived in Montreal in 1990 up until the current time, the extent to which my lab has interacted with different companies for all kinds of different things. We worked with Merck because they had a Chagas disease, a parasitic outbreak in their monkey colony. We worked with the Public Health Agency of Canada with a number of contracts, and eventually I took over the National Reference Lab for Parasite Diagnostics. Worked with vaccine companies and therapeutic companies. Methylgene was making a new antibacterial, basically a beta-lactamase inhibitor. And whenever you see these little explosions on the slide, that means that the company went bust. I also worked as an advisor, Quebec Immunization Committee, National Advisory Committee, and I consider these advisory committees for government to be very similar to industry contracts, because in fact the expertise that you gain in some of these advisory roles can actually be leveraged and used for other things. So for example, through my role on these advisory committees to government, on vaccines and vaccine safety, particularly the Advisory Committee on Causality assessment that I was part of, that actually gave me great experience in evaluating vaccine adverse events. And that led to my involvement with the US Department of Justice in the MMR autism case, as well as acting as a consultant for the government of Quebec in vaccine adverse events cases, as well as some private legal actions. So saying yes to being on a government advisory committee can actually give you expertise that has, in fact, commercial value. And where are we going? There we go. More recently, worked with a small biotech, Intellivax, which then morphed into ID Biomed, which then morphed into GSK, and working on scientific advisory boards for CIHR, for example, not just governments, but also CIHR. These kinds of things teach you how to apply for grants, right? So when somebody asks you to work on a grant review panel early in your career, you should say yes, because the best way to learn how to write a good grant is to actually be on one of these panels. You can see there are explosions all over the place. Many of these efforts have just not worked. They've taken time, they've distracted me, but each one has taught me something. In many cases, that something is how to be more careful in choosing the partners that I work with, but others have done brilliantly. So for example, you see the little, up at the top of the screen, you can see some fireworks here. Intellivax was a small company that was developing vaccines based on a platform called Proteosomes. It was purchased by ID Biomedical. And when ID Biomedical was bought by GSK, I had been given a small number of stock options here as part of my work, as part of my compensation. And because of this major purchase by GSK, these relatively small number of stock options actually paid for our children's registered educational savings plans. So there are some significant remunerations that are possible within the context of these interactions. And throughout this entire time, I was also running grant-driven science funded by NIH, foundations, CIHR, and other organizations. So academic industry collaborations, okay? There's this long-standing view that academic collaborations with industry are like going over to the dark side, filled with jealousy, paranoia. Many people think that it's a one-way trip. If you go over to the dark side, you'll never come back. There are issues of basic vocabulary. We don't even understand, as academics, some of the things that business people talk about: venture capital, exit strategies, market capitalization, and so on. And if you talk to academic colleagues, there are all kinds of horror stories about people who have had their ideas stolen, lost intellectual property, very bad relationships. And there's a complete misunderstanding generally of the strengths and limitations of industry on the academic side. And in fact, there's a remarkable lack of curiosity, I think, and to some extent courage about entering into this very foreign world. And there's also a serious misunderstanding about conflict of interest. And Manish is actually leading an effort now to try to define how we think about conflict of interest in the area of vaccine development. And hopefully there'll be a publication coming out with Manish and his colleagues in the near future to talk about that. Why is it not letting me go forward? Oh, well, I have to do it this way. Okay, so for example, we don't really have some idea as academics. We're not taught, what does it mean to sit on a clinical or scientific advisory board for a company? What are the implications of that role? Do we have to disclose it? Are people looking for our ideas, or are they looking for advice? We have no idea. What does it mean to accept speakers' fees or to be on a speakers bureau? What does intellectual property actually mean, including words like dominant patents and subordinate patents? Companies often talk, especially small companies, about non-dilutive funding. What does that mean? It usually means that the company itself is not paying for the research dollars that you can generate. So if I get a CIHR grant that furthers the aims of a company and it has $500,000 in the pot of funding, the company has the huge advantage of that money because it does not dilute their investment capital, for example. And we just really don't know how to treat non-disclosure agreements, confidentiality. Academics are pretty loose-lipped as a general rule. Equity, stock options, due diligence, and things like forward-thinking statements. We just don't understand what they're like. And anybody in an academic world who has never had to deal with a Gantt chart has something miserable to look forward to when they're first confronted with a Gantt chart. Here, for example, is a typical industry forward-looking statement. And if you are doing work with industry in a collaborative relationship or a contract, and you're going to present the data, very often the company lawyers will insist that you put this kind of gobbledygook in front of your presentation, which many of us find really troubling. A Gantt chart is something that I consider to be hell on paper, because it's basically completely different from a CIHR grant or an NIH grant, where they give you the money and 5 years later, they ask you how you did. With a Gantt chart, that's not what happens. Each of those bars means this is when the project, this aspect of the project is starting, this is when it's finishing, and if there's a problem and you'll go beyond the finish date, you need to explain why. This Gantt chart for a large project that I had with the government of Quebec and Medicago had a 13-page Gantt chart. This is just one of the pages, which is why I refer to them as hell on paper. Okay, how do academics view industry? Well, this is the general idea that, you know, it's my idea. I'd like you to support me. There's a lot of money in that satchel, but I always want it to be my idea. And many academics think that this is the industry view of academics. And I hope that after this discussion that you will actually be more of the small diagram to the right type of academic, where you can actually hold your own in an academic industry collaboration. Okay, aside from the interest in academic industry collaborations, there's a huge advantage to doing this, right? Most of us are not in science, certainly not in medical science, just to spend time in the lab. We're in the medical scientific environment so that we can bring our ideas to people and make lives better. Well, you need money to do that. And pharma research and development spending is incredible in terms of billions of dollars. And if you look at how much they spend on research, it's actually pretty impressive that they spend at least as much, if not more, on marketing. And so in fact, if you trainees really want a job in pharmacy, the most cost-effective thing you could do right now is to ditch your PhD and get a degree in marketing. Probably not many of you are going to follow this advice, but in fact, pharma has to sell what they make. They would not exist if they did not sell what they made. And so it's an inevitable part of interaction with industry that if you are developing products, you need to be ready to deal with not only the development part of an evaluation part of the product, but then the marketing part. And you have to be very careful of your integrity as you move through those different stages. Okay, as researchers, it's actually really important that you look around you and try to identify what could be your platform. What is a situation that you have unique access to that you could offer to other people as a platform for doing work. And certainly, I'm giving you examples here of a few at McGill. When I arrived, there was the JD Tropical Diseases Center. And in fact, we had people coming in with tropical diseases, and we recognized early that one of the things that we had that was unique was access to patient samples. And so we were actually able, under appropriate ethics control, to take blood samples of people who had malaria or other parasitic diseases and stool samples from people who had distinct parasites, and then sell them to companies that needed quality control materials. And for the last 15, 20 years, the Tropical Disease Center has made between $100,000 and $170,000 a year selling those materials to quality assurance companies, right? That's interesting. That's the kind of thing that if you think outside of the box, you can do. If you have a unique model or an assay or a reagent, or you have targeted expertise, these are things that are actually marketable. And you should think about doing so if you have any interest in interacting with governments, industry, and others, even lawyers. Okay, is the relationship with industry predatory, or is it a partnership? And there are some really good examples in my life of bad experiences. So for example, I started one of those lines on those first slides. I started on the scientific advisory board of IntelliVax. It was a little company it moved from Boston to Quebec for the tax advantages, and its lead products were vaccines for influenza and Shigella, based on this proteasome, outer membrane protein of Neisseria species technology. I applied for CIHR awards. We got about $1.5 million from CIHR over the years to develop these nanoparticulate vaccines. IntelliVax was bought by ID Biomedical, and ID Biomedical also bought the influenza manufacturing capacity of Shire Biologics. More CIHR industry awards. We actually developed some really cool vaccines for influenza, shigellosis. We had the best inactivated measles vaccine that had ever been published. Patents were submitted between McGill and this company. And then ID Biomedical was bought by GSK because GSK wanted the influenza vaccine manufacturing capacity and nothing else. And the entire program was killed. All of the patents were lost because they had been signed over to industry. And so about 12 years of work disappeared. And so we had no recourse. You could wait for 23, 25 years until the patents are back on the, sorry, my brother is calling me. And I can't talk right now, Bruce, sorry. And we lost all of that effort. And so this was not a particularly good experience. On the other hand, you have to be ready to seize opportunities. And so this actually worked pretty well. The Tropical Disease Center got called from a panicked pathologist at one point from a local contract research organization that had lots of monkeys. And she had sliced her finger while performing an autopsy on a monkey with lung lesions. And it turned out that the sample from the lungs was growing a mycobacterium sent to St. Hyacinth, the veterinary school. And so, you have lots of opportunities at this point, right? As a physician, we could have seen the pathologist and coordinate with St. Hyacinth for the identification. You could see the pathologist and organize transfer of the specimen to our lab for identification, see the pathologist transfer the sample and contact the vet company, the company vet. Or you could do lots of things and contact the company president and say, maybe you have a problem. Maybe you have Mycobacterium tuberculosis in your monkey facility. And as it turns out, in this case, they did. They had tuberculosis in their monkey facility. They lost all 35 monkeys in their facility. That pathologist had been exposed to Mycobacterium tuberculosis. And in fact, this led to a major collaboration between our center and this large and growing contract research organization that is now Charles River on the West Island of Montreal. So we established a 25-year relationship with them that in fact was initiated with the screening of their employees for Mycobacterium tuberculosis, involved counseling and care. That was medical. It involved developing an employee health program because they had no program for vaccinating their animals or their employees. It led to an animal health program. It led to a monkey bite consultation program, which has gone over 25 years and has actually contributed to government documents and publications. Huge expertise in animal-related industries and subsequent contracts from other contract research organizations and even zoos, which have been actually really a lot of fun. To go into the biodome and to other local zoos. So this project that started with a telephone call that was not really in our area of expertise actually led to quite a number of interesting things. On the other hand, it actually, in retrospect, was a missed opportunity because in fact, one of the worries about macaques and non-human primates is that they can carry a simian B virus, which is fatal to human beings. And in fact, every macaque is tested on purchase and upon accident, and every employee is also tested as well. There was an opportunity way back 25 years ago that we could have set up these assays, and that could have been a major profit center for us, but we actually missed that opportunity, and that opportunity was actually taken up by others in the United States. But in retrospect, that's something that we could have and perhaps should have done. Another opportunity, while I was serving on the National Advisory Committee on Immunization as a vaccine immunologist, Gaston Dessert and Danuta Skoronsky in Quebec and BC described this weird syndrome following an influenza vaccine. And it turned out that at time, Canada had 2 influenza vaccines, one made by Shire and the other made by Sanofi Pasteur. And this ocular respiratory syndrome that had never been seen before was seen with only one of these vaccines. And at that time, Andy Shelton, pictured here, who was willing to deal with Health Canada, but he really resisted the effort as a company to spend millions and millions of dollars to find a cause. And so what would you do? What would I do at that time? You could side with Health Canada because you're a vaccine advisor and pressure the company to throw money at the problem. You could side with the company and hope that they'd give you money because they were grateful for your help. Or you could act as an honest broker between both sides. And alternatively, you could ask as an honest broker, but in fact, you're spending a lot of time doing this. And so you should ask both sides to help to pay you to be a consultant to figure this out. And in fact, that's what I did with full transparency to both sides and said, look, this is a real problem. We need to find out an answer. But I can't spend my time. I'm an academic. I can't spend a huge amount of time doing this because I put all of my others' activity at risk by doing so. And so in fact, the outcome of this was that there's been now almost a 20-year interaction with Andy Shelton, because I did work with both the Public Health Agency of Canada and the company to broker a limited number of studies that actually revealed what the problem was with their industrial process. That industrial process was changed. Andy lost his job when ID Biomed, Shire, was purchased by GSK. And then I lost contact with him for a little while, but he was subsequently asked to become the chief executive officer of Medicago, the small company that was making vaccines in plants. He asked me to join the company as a scientific advisor. And since then, my involvement with Medicago has grown from scientific advisor to running their first vaccine studies, to organizing very large multi-million-dollar grants with support from DARPA in the United States and the Quebec government in Canada. And I'm now their medical officer for the last several years formally. That company is the one that I think will probably be the best bet for providing a vaccine for the current COVID crisis. So it's actually provided me with enormous opportunities to do very interesting things, both at the basic science level and at the clinical level. So as an academic, you have to keep thinking of good ideas, but you also have to look for opportunities and learn the languages. This is something that you are interested in doing. And you really have to be open to things that are not precisely in your area of interest. A lot of academics basically say, this is what I do best, and if you come in with an idea that's outside of my area of interest, right over here, I'm not even going to look at it. If that is the life that you want to lead scientifically, well, then you will probably not have good opportunities in industry or with governments. And you clearly have to network. You have to say yes, particularly at an early stage in your career, to act on scientific advisory committees, to do due diligence for companies that are looking at investing in different areas, on government advisory committees, government review committees, and so on. Say yes, and you will actually, if you keep your eyes and ears open, it will lead to other opportunities. Okay, let's be realistic about this, however. Most academics are really not well suited, certainly to be chief executive officers of companies, and many of them are not even well suited to be scientific officers, chief scientific officers for companies, right? Our area of expertise typically is down here. We have energy, ideas, and passion. Many academics survive in a consultative or scientific role into the medium-sized company where we are focusing on the idea because companies need to focus, right? They need to get a product and start generating capital. Clearly, the small companies have lots of energy, passion, and now much more teamwork. And then when you move to the large company, you have the idea. You are now really focused. And there's also a level of discipline and organization that most academics have great difficulty living with. We are not necessarily people who are willing to work in a well-structured and disciplined box. Okay, let's clear up some of the misconceptions. Okay, as an academic, you're smarter than people in industry. Not true. Some of the smartest people I've ever met work in industry, and I'm proud to say that many of them are collaborators at Medicago. As an academic, you work harder than people in industry. That's also absolute, complete bull. People in industry work their butts off. As an academic, you'll earn less money than people in industry. Well, that's probably true. At least in industry, you won't have to write grants all the time. That's also absolutely not true, especially not for young companies that are growing, because many of those companies are actually reliant on grants, not from CIHR necessarily, but from government agencies, philanthropic agencies, and so on. And there's a really big difference between academics and industry. You could be fired by industry if you don't do your job. And so you need to be prepared for that if you are, in fact, moving a large part of your life into industry. And in fact, we have this conceit in academics that, you know, we lead. And in fact, in major academic industry collaborations, that's usually not true. Once your idea is moving forward into industry, once it becomes the focus of your industrial partner, you're going to be eclipsed, right? You no longer lead in many cases. And so you have to be prepared for that. And that's the point at which many academics blow out of these relationships. Okay? Be prepared. Not everything works out. I've showed you some good examples, some bad examples, and absolutely not everything works out. I worked with a company called Methylgene from 1996 to 2009. They exploited some McGill intellectual property, not mine, to make candidate anti-cancer and antimicrobial therapies. I'm a microbiologist, and so they asked a simple question: can you do minimal inhibitory concentrations for potential beta-lactamase inhibitors? I'm a virologist and a parasitologist. I hate bacteria, but it was something that was easy to do, and so I said yes, I could do it. So we decided to set up some assays, in vitro and in vitro. I hired a technician and I hired a student, and we worked with this company over structure-activity relationships over a period of 10 years on the antimicrobial therapies. So it was pure contract work. I hired a master's student, and I made sure that the master's student was allowed to publish, right? You have to protect your students' rights to publish. And there were some excellent class AC beta-lactamase candidates that were developed over this time. I learned a ton from the chemists at the company. I also learned a lot of vocabulary. Unfortunately, their lead cancer drug, which was actually potentially quite interesting, it was a histone deacetylase inhibitor, was put on a hold at a very critical point for the company, and the whole company imploded, even though the beta-lactamase work was really interesting in 2009. So you could look at this and say that there's 13 years of effort lost, but in fact, we had revenue from the structure-activity relationships and the animal testing that were critical to my lab through an early part of my career, right? I started my lab in 1991. And so for this 10-year period, I actually had this little cash cow that was keeping my lab going. It paid for a technician. Clearly, this was not the only thing the technician did. And it was actually enormously beneficial to me to do this. And as I say, I learned a great deal through this relationship. Okay, I'm sure you're all aware that the funding environment is changing. There's been a much greater emphasis over the last decade on outcomes, right? And so we really need to find ways to exploit and use the strengths of both academics and industry. We need to teach scientists the business vocabulary early and encourage and value the academic industry ties. Support back and forth movement and exchange with actually students moving and doing work in the industry labs. So several of my students have in fact left my lab after their postdocs or PhDs and moved directly to industry. And I've hosted industry scientists in my lab. I currently host one in my lab. And he is of enormous value to the lab because of the expertise he brings. You have to make clear guidelines for conflict of interest, and you have to be completely transparent in your handling of conflicts of interest so that everybody knows what you're doing and why you're doing it. And universities have historically focused on intellectual property rather than contracts, licenses, and products. And with all due respect to senior industry academic people who might be on this call, this I think is pretty dumb. Because generally, universities have no idea how to exploit intellectual property, and companies do. And so we need to have a much more intelligent movement of our ideas into industry through productive collaborations that actually move these ideas towards products and interventions. Okay, this is just another example of what's happening, and these are examples in industry around vaccines, simply to say that vaccines are no longer the little guys in the pharmaceutical industry. There have been massive movements, and the COVID example is very clear right now. There is a great deal of money to be made in industry, and there's a great deal of money that can be spent on research in developing vaccines, not just for infectious diseases, although some new vaccines will be developed, obviously, for HIV, tuberculosis, syphilis, and so on, that will earn people a lot of money and be very good science. But we are moving into an era where we probably will be able to prevent and treat many things with vaccines by using some of the new technologies. So autoimmune conditions, cancers, many of these things will be treated or controlled with some of the new technologies that are being moved very rapidly towards clinical trials, in part because of the massive funding given to the COVID vaccines. The major pharma model has changed. There used to be centralization of research facilities, dispersal of research facilities all over the world. That has changed. Big pharma has moved many of their peripheral research facilities out of cities. So Montreal, for example, in the last decade has lost AstraZeneca, Merck, and GSK. There's been an overall reduction in upstream research. So the basic discovery science and the preclinical work really is no longer done in-house. Companies have much more targeted pipelines, and they're filling their pipelines through acquisition of already de-risked projects. So the small companies, the medium-sized companies, are the innovator companies that are bringing their products through the early phases of basic science discovery, toxicity, and even early phase 1, early phase 2 studies at which they are purchased lock, stock, and barrel by these big companies. This is exactly what happened with COVID-2 vaccines, right? No big company was working on a corona or any coronavirus vaccine in 2019, zero. But within a 6-month period, all of the warp speed money in the United States is going to big pharma, which is just extraordinary. Even though Moderna, a small company, was on the list of the 5 winners, in fact, Sanofi is partnering with Moderna to actually produce the vaccine. So a huge amount of the benefit of this intellectual development is going to go to Sanofi. And the others are Pfizer, AstraZeneca, and so on. Okay, so this model is working, but it means that what it means is that the opportunities for academics to work with these small and medium-sized companies are greater than they have ever been. Okay, I think this is almost the second to last slide. I think everybody worries about funding, okay? And if I look back over 25 years, and this is approximate, but if I look back over 25 years of where my money came to do research, right? Because I've had grant funding, I've had a funded laboratory for 30 years. And in the first 25 years of that 30 years, I got money from aid agencies for research, so places like USAID, CETA, private NGOs, public funding, CIHR and NIH, and industry. And the list of places where I actually got major support is partial on the right here. You can see that, in fact, I didn't assume that I was always going to be able to have CIHR funding for my lab or NSERC funding for my lab. And I don't think that model works very well anymore. I would encourage all of you to look very broadly at where the funding might come from, because this has been very successful for me over the last 30 years. And I suspect that this is going to be the way to move forward in the future, to have a successful long-term research-driven lab. Okay, and so I think we need to actually move away from this idea that industry is evil. And I think this is my favorite picture. Industry is like your big sister. It's not always easy to get along with them, but you can't live without them, certainly if you're developing vaccines, okay? So academic industry collaborations, they can work, but they need to be carefully cultivated. You need to be open to them in the first place. You need to be careful at all times. There is no stupid question when talking to anybody, in fact, but certainly no stupid question when you're talking to a potential industry collaborator. And they are most successful when you start from a point of mutual understanding. Okay, that is what I had prepared, and we're at 40 minutes. If we can open it to questions, I guess, is that the next stage?
Yes. Thanks, Dr. Ward. Really wonderful talk. I think we're applauding you over Zoom. And I see the first question is already on the chat line. While others are considering their questions, please feel free to put it in the chat line. It just makes us easier to run through them. From Elaine Kwok, what would be your recommendations for early career scientists? Example, postdoc, early career faculty on pursuing academic industry partnership. Thinking that some of these collaborations may be short-lived and can change with companies' focus acquisition, and that the partnership may not yield products of interest to the university, example, be counted towards tenure?
Yeah, that's a really, really good question. So the short answer to that question is do it, but do it carefully. And the longer answer to that question is make sure that everybody knows what you're doing and that you get advice. So for example, if you're a postdoc in someone's lab, you need to make sure that your supervisor understands what you're doing and encourages you to do it. You also need to make sure that there are likely to be outcomes that will be to your benefit. So for example, if your supervisor is really interested in this project, but there is no obvious way for you to publish, that is a bad idea. Most industry collaborations will put most good industry collaborations will put some limits on your ability to publish, 30 or 90-day waiting periods while intellectual property is protected. But very, very few good industrial academic relationships will prohibit you from publishing. And I've given advice to many PhD students and postdocs who are in what I consider to be abusive relationships, where the professor actually has a personal interest in the company doing well, so some intellectual property or stock options, but that individual is not protecting their trainees. There are some activities that I run in my lab that I will not let my students participate in because there are no academic outputs, right? They will not be authors on papers, or the authorship might be too late for it to benefit them. But there are other, and those are done under what would be considered academic industry contract relationships or service agreements. I have the ability to do something. The industry wants me to do it. I do it with technicians or research associates. We give them the data. We have no control over what's done with it. They pay us, and they pay us well. You need to know what your value is. Those can be very lucrative activities. If you're doing an industry academic collaborative agreement type activity, then there have to be advantages in terms of presentation, publication, intellectual property for the students or the postdocs. So everybody's just got to be completely transparent about it.
Okay.
And you have to be ready to say no. No, I don't want to do that.
So the next question is from Shannon McDonald. She says, "Hi, Brian, we've talked before at CARE meetings, but I think the rest of this group would be interested in hearing about how many of these principles also applied to collaboration with government, example, provincial government grants. Specifically, we never seem to think about conflict of interest with government or other organizations, and we still need to attend to things like intellectual property ownership."
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. I've been saying the same thing for 30 years. And the best example that I can think of is if I'm giving advice to Merck on vaccine use, clearly everybody would say that I have a potential conflict of interest and I have to be transparent about it. If I'm giving vaccine advice to the province of Ontario, most people or many people would consider that I have no conflict of interest at all, right? Because the government of Ontario, the Public Health Agency of Ontario, is a good guy, not a bad guy. But if I'm giving advice, for example, to Kaiser Permanente, a for-profit health maintenance organization in the United States, again, I'm in conflict of interest. But in fact, in terms of vaccine usage, the government of Ontario and Kaiser Permanente are actually very similar. And I would probably be giving the same advice to those two groups because Ontario Health is a single party payer for healthcare in Ontario, just like Kaiser Permanente as a health maintenance organization in the United States. So if I give advice to a government around vaccine use, I think I should be declaring my conflict of interest for that activity as well.
Okay, thank you. The next question from Manish Sadrangani. "Thanks, Brian, for agreeing to take time to talk today. I think this is highly valuable. My text exists specifically to help foster these sorts of relationships and maybe an easier start for some. Do you have any comments specifically about this process?"
Oh, how to do it? Yeah, certainly as a PhD student or a postdoc, there might be limited opportunities. As junior faculty, I think there are more opportunities. And so, for example, we tend to view certain conferences as being more academic or more industry. If you have a really interesting idea, right, and you're developing some intellectual property around your idea, I think it's a great idea to go to both conferences. So you go to the more academic, so the Canadian Society for Immunology, for example, right? That's an academic conference. But you might also, if it's in the area of vaccines, you might also consider submitting an abstract to one of the World Vaccine Congresses, which is heavily attended. Those conferences are heavily attended by industry. And you might be very surprised that industry people will come up to you after you've given the, so you give your abstract, your talk at the Canadian Society for Immunology, and people come up and say, "Oh, that's really cool. Maybe we could collaborate to do this, right? Let's write a grant to do something." That's really great. You go to the industry-dominated conferences, and the same quality of scientists might come up to you and say, "This is a really great idea. We'd like to work with you to further develop this idea either into an assay or into a product, or we'd like to pay you to do this assay for us under these circumstances." Right? They're both collaborations, they're potentially very different, and the outcomes may be very, very different.
So just before we go on to the next question, which is from Megan, I have a quick question for Dr. Ward. Many of the people who are on the call today are very early in their career. Can you reflect back on some of the key moments in your life, which mentors, what instances led you into a career that embraces industry as a way to improve outcomes and do better for society? What were some of the key moments, and how did you make this happen in your career as a young scientist?
Okay, all young scientists are curious. And I think that many academic centers try to put blinders on that curiosity. And I think that if you're not curious about how to take health interventions through to products, you need to expand your horizons. Many research institutes and universities are starting to make diploma courses or other courses available to graduate students and postdocs that allow them, for example, to take business courses at night, so that you at least start to understand some of the vocabulary. At the Research Institute of the McGill University Health Center, we did this about a decade ago, and it's a very popular program. It's oversubscribed for the last decade. What's really interesting, and the people at McGill are going to be mad at me when I say this, but when we came up with this idea a decade ago, we suggested it to the McGill Business School, and they were not all that interested in it, because they also had these sort of blinders on. You know, we do what we do. And so after a while of hitting the door, we actually went to the John Molson School of Business at Concordia, and we said, we have an idea. We think that our students and trainees would love this. And within 8 weeks, we had the program organized and up and running at the John Molson School of Business. And so I actually think that you not only need to be curious, and if you have an idea along these lines, you also need to be a little bit persistent, and be ready to, you know, walk out of the box. Because we were a group of McGill academics that walked off the McGill campus and went to Concordia and said, we're not getting what we want from McGill. Is this something you guys can do? And the program has been really successful.
That's very good advice. Be ready to walk out of the box. I think that's certainly something we should all take to heart. And at CCHCSP, we are encouraging these creative partnerships, and in the new rebranding of CCHCSP, we will be looking at this more closely, and in particular, thinking about linking ties with MyTax, a group that's doing this.
Great idea.
Better. Yeah.
A great idea.
So if anyone has any connections there, we'd love a connection and encouragement to join forces. From Megan Beggs, thank you, Dr. Ward. 2 questions. What are some key differences in seeking funding support from a federal agency versus industry partner? And if a trainee goes from academia to industry, do you think it's difficult to go back to academia?
Sure. There are real differences, and the Gantt chart is one of them. If you apply for CIHR funding or NIH funding, the typical model is you give them ideas, you tell them what you're planning on doing for 3 or 5 years, they give you the money, and then you give them an end of grant report on what you did. And so you could, in theory, do nothing or do something completely different. That would not be good for your academic career necessarily, but in theory, you could do that. In industry, that isn't ever going to happen. And in industry academic collaborations, that certainly won't happen. And some of the philanthropic organizations actually take a very much more business approach. So if you write a grant to the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, they might give you a little bit of money, $100,000 for a 6-month or 1-year award. But if you want to grow that into a much larger award or a multi-year award, you better do what you say you were going to do. You'd better have a plan. You'd better have a schedule. You'd better tell them what your timelines are. And for the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, for example, if you don't meet your timelines, because they evaluate you through the longer periods, right? They evaluate you periodically. If you're not meeting your goals, they stop the money. Industry monitors each activity. And and this is true in industry academic relationships too. If you're in an academic lab and you say to your industry partner, I'm going to do this within this timeline, and you don't get it done, you need to explain to them why you didn't get it done and what your mitigation strategy is for getting it done and what's your timeline. And I've talked for too long, so I don't know what the second half of that question was. This is the trouble with getting old.
If a trainee goes from academia to industry, do you think it's difficult to go back to academia?
It's difficult, but not impossible. One of my favorite people in the world, Connie Crozier, was in industry for probably 12 years at Merck, and came back to McGill when the Merck facility left Quebec, and came to McGill and established herself with a very nice research career. I think you have to have good ideas, you have to be a really good scientist, and you have to be ready to put in the hours to come back. But I know several of my friends and colleagues who've done just that. Industry for a decade, and they've come back into academics. It's hard, there's no question about it, but it certainly can be done. And a shorter period of time, for example, a MITAX postdoctoral fellowship, even a 5-year MITAX postdoc, industry academics, that is a brilliant career strategy for both industry and academics.
And we have one long question here, but I think the concept is very important. From Marilee Brockway, she's an expert in infant feeding. Where working with formula industry or bottle breast pump companies has resulted in shunning of researchers and barring them from many professional conferences. Also, there are journals in our field who refuse to accept manuscripts from researchers whose research is affiliated with industry. I really struggle even with attending talks that are sponsored by industry because I will be and have been attacked by other researchers for attending. Stating potential or perceived conflicts of interest does not seem to satisfy some people in this field. Do you have any advice on how to navigate this? And again, this is a broader question about culture, so maybe you can address that.
Yeah, well, I'm living it. Medicago, the principal shareholder for Medicago, the company I worked with, was the Philip Morris Foundation, so tobacco. The plants we use to produce the vaccines at Medicago by transient transfection are an Australian relative of the tobacco plant called Nicotiana benthamiana. And we use them because they produce huge amounts of protein in their leaves. They're easily manipulated. So it's a lovely transient transfection system, but the WHO treats us in much the same way that they treat the formula companies, right? We are by definition evil. And it is actually really hard sometimes where you are not invited to a conference where you should be going because you are painted with the same brush. Medicago would not exist. That platform technology, which I think is probably one of the best hopes for a vaccine at scale in Canada for COVID, that company would not exist without the support that we got from the Philip Morris Institute for about a decade before the company was purchased by Mitsubishi Tanube Pharma Corp. And so, you know, how do you explain that? Well, you basically say, I'm a lifetime never smoked person. I think that much of what the tobacco industry have done is reprehensible. But at the same time, this is, I think, bad money put to good purpose, as far as I'm concerned. And we have to live with it. You need to find a way. So I'm not shy about saying that I really don't like what tobacco companies have done. I don't stand up and, you know, protest at McGill to defund um, the formula companies or tobacco industry. But I really don't like much of what that industry did. Honestly, I really don't like a lot of what the, for example, what Volkswagen did with the fudging of their emissions tests, right? Does that mean that I would never buy a Volkswagen? I don't know. So I think you have to be, I think you're in a similar situation to the one we're in with the formula industry. And so if you hate it, if you can't stand it, you need to find a way to move into a more broadly socially acceptable area of research. But that might be hard to do.
With that, we're almost at the hour. We really want to thank Dr. Ward. Warm CCHCSP applause. And we are grateful that you took time out from your busy schedule, from fighting COVID-19 to inspire us all. And we wish you the best. And we hope to hear good news from your research and the company in the coming months. So thank you very much, Dr. Ward.